He was the kind of customer whispered about in the staff locker room like a ghost story. A man so infamous that his name alone could drain the color from a server's face. Henry Blackthorne, a freight magnate whose fortune stretched across oceans, but whose reputation for cruelty was sharper than the knives laid on linen at the Golden Lantern. Every Tuesday evening, the ritual began. His black Lincoln pulled up to the curb at precisely 7:30. The valet opened the door, and out stepped a figure built like an oak, tall, broad, his steel-gray hair cut with military precision. His shoes struck the marble floor with the authority of a judge's gavel. And in that moment, the atmosphere of the restaurant shifted. Plates rattled faintly in nervous hands. The room's chatter dropped to a murmur like a church when the pastor pauses mid-sermon. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim at his presence. The Golden Lantern was no ordinary restaurant. It was a sanctuary for old Money City politicians and retired industrialists who still liked to be seen. Its dining room glowed with amber sconces and polished brass. To its guests, it was elegance. To its staff, it was a stage, and Henry Blackthorne was the performance they dreaded. Every Tuesday, the same table number 9 tucked in a private alcove with a sweeping view of the riverfront skyline. The staff called it the Monster's Booth. They had all learned the rules. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact for more than a second. And above all, never ever challenge him. Those who had tried found their shifts mysteriously cut or worse, their jobs gone entirely after some unexplained phone call. For years, the unspoken ritual held steady, serve him in silence, withstand the storm, and hope he vanished back into the night. But then came Clara Dawson. She was 24, new to the Lantern, with a quiet determination in her hazel eyes. Clara wasn't there for prestige. She was there because the paycheck was bigger than any other restaurant in the city, and her family needed it. Her mother's medical bills were stacked on the kitchen counter back home like unpaid debts to fate. Her younger brother's tuition check loomed over her like a shadow. For Clara, this wasn't about fine dining or rubbing shoulders with the city's elite. It was survival. Her first week had been a blur of polish and protocol memorizing wine lists, longer than some novels learning the choreography of 7 different forks and moving like a ghost among people who wore cufflinks worth more than her car. Nobody had bothered to warn her about Henry Blackthorne. Not directly, not until it was too late. On her second Tuesday, the short straw landed in her hands. The designated server for table 9 called in sick, as they often did. Mr. Peterson, the floor manager, pale with dread, scanned the room until his gaze fell on Clara. His voice was tight, almost a whisper. Dawson. You're up. Clara smoothed her apron, tucked a leather-bound menu under her arm, and walked across the dining room. Conversations dipped. Forks stilled. Every eye followed her like she was marching to the gallows. Henry Blackthorne sat already in his booth, staring out the window at the river's dark shimmer. His profile looked carved from stone. He did not turn as she approached. "Good evening," Sir Clara said evenly, her voice steady despite the silence pressing down on her. "Welcome to the Golden Lantern. May I present you with tonight's menu?" At last he turned. His eyes, icy pale unyielding, swept over her as if appraising not a person, but an object searching for flaws. The air between them seemed to crackle a clash of wills no one else dared to test. And then Clara did the unthinkable. She held his gaze. For the first time in years, the script of fear was broken. Henry Blackthorne turned fully toward her, his gaze sharp as broken ice. His suit, midnight blue cut with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, caught the low light like polished armor. The silence at table 9 stretched thick and suffocating, as if the entire restaurant were waiting for the executioner's blade to fall. "You're new," he said at last, his voice low, each word pressed flat with disdain. "They're letting novices handle this table now." Standards must be slipping. The words landed like a slap in the quiet room. Clara felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but she forced herself to breathe. She thought of her mother's fragile smile after chemo, of her brother's textbooks stacked on the dining table back home. Failure was a luxury she couldn't afford. So instead of shrinking, she straightened her shoulders and let the words leave her lips with a calm clarity that belied the storm inside her. "The only thing slipping tonight, sir," she said evenly, "will be the butter on your bread roll." The dining room froze. Forks halted midair. A waiter across the room pressed his hand into his mouth. Even Mr. Peterson, standing stiff near the bar, paled, as if he'd just witnessed a car crash in slow motion. No one spoke to Henry Blackthorne that way. For a heartbeat, Blackthorne didn't move. His eyes narrowed, cold and calculating, like a hawk measuring the strength of its prey. Then, with a grunt that could have meant amusement or annoyance, he leaned back in his booth. "Filet mignon," he said, his voice clipped. "Medium rare. But more rare than medium. If it's pink, it goes back. Sauce in a separate dish, not touching the plate. And bring me a bottle of 1982 Petrus." He didn't glance at the menu. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew it was one of the rarest, most expensive wines in the cellar. A power move. A test. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears, but her face remained composed. She wrote his order with steady hands, bowed her head just enough to acknowledge him, and turned on her heel. She didn't run. She didn't stumble. Her steps were measured, graceful, like a performer walking off stage. In the kitchen, she delivered the order to Chef Antoine, who muttered curses under his breath but began searing the steak with theatrical fury. Meanwhile, the Petrus was retrieved from its velvet-lined resting place in the deep cellar, carried as if it were a newborn child. Minutes later, Clara returned to table 9, the bottle cradled in her hands. She presented the label, uncorked it with flawless precision, and poured the tasting portion. Henry swirled the wine, holding it to the light, then took a slow sip. His expression revealed nothing. "Acceptable," he said. Clara filled his glass to the precise level and stepped back. She did not allow relief to show on her face. She simply waited calm and steady until his meal was finished. When the evening ended, Henry placed his black card into the leather folio. Clara processed it, returned the receipt for his signature, and collected the slip once he was gone. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The bills swollen by the Petrus totaled several $1,000s. On the tip line, where Henry Blackthorne was known to leave no more than the standard 20%, was a number that made Clara's breath catch. It was nearly equal to her 2-week paycheck, and beneath his harsh, slanted signature were 2 words, scribbled like a riddle, for perseverance. Around her, the staff gathered in disbelief. Brenda, the veteran waitress, shook her head in awe. "He's never done that. Not once." Clara said nothing. She simply folded the slip, tucked it into her apron, and walked away. Inside, though, a single thought echoed louder than the clatter of dishes and murmured gossip. This was no ordinary customer. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The slip with "for perseverance" still burned in Clara's apron pocket when Peterson summoned her to the back. The staff room was no larger than a walk-in closet, its walls lined with scuffed lockers and the faint smell of bleach clinging to the air. A few of the senior waiters had gathered there, already their eyes wide with the mix of awe and terror that followed her confrontation with Henry Blackthorne. Peterson paced the narrow space like a man waiting for a verdict. His shirt collar was undone, his face damp with nervous sweat. He stopped abruptly, fixing Clara with a gaze that carried equal parts admiration and dread. "What in God's name were you thinking?" he hissed. "I told you, be quiet, be invisible. You gave him wit. You gave him eye contact. Do you have any idea what you've just risked?" Clara straightened. "I only did my job," she said softly, though her voice carried a steel edge. "He belittled me." I answered politely. Politely, Brenda, the veteran waitress, scoffed. "Clara, you don't understand. This isn't a man you correct. He's not just another rude guest. Henry Blackthorne." She trailed off, folding her arms tight across her chest. "He's dangerous." The words hung in the air like a chill draft. Clara frowned. "Dangerous how?" Peterson exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "2 years ago, a boy named Thomas worked here. Fresh out of college. Good kid. Blackthorne claimed his soup was cold. It wasn't, but Thomas, trying to be helpful, said, 'I can assure you, sir, it came straight from the pot.' That night, Blackthorne made a call. The next day, Thomas's father, who worked as a manager at a mid-sized supply company, was out of a job. That company had just lost its biggest contract, a contract tied directly to Blackthorne's empire. Do you understand? One remark over soup, and a family lost their livelihood. The room went still. Clara felt a shiver trace down her spine. This was more than arrogance. This was power wielded like a weapon. But why? Clara whispered. Why would a man with everything do that? Brenda's hardened expression softened just enough to reveal pity. Because he lost everything. Peterson nodded grimly. Years back, Henry had a wife, Margaret, and a little girl, Emily. 6 years old, bright as a sunrise, they said. One night driving home, a drunk driver blew through a red light. Killed them both instantly. Clara's breath caught. The man responsible was rich. Powerful family. He got a lawyer who twisted the law into knots. The sentence, a few months without a license. Some community service. That's all. Peterson's voice cracked with disgust. Henry Blackthorne walked into that courthouse a man. He walked out a shell. Since then, he's been like this hard, cold, cruel. He couldn't control justice, so now he controls everything else. The temperature of his soup, the color of the wine, the exact shade of red in a steak. Tuesday nights. They're his theater of control, and the rest of us are just the audience. Clara sat in silence, the weight of the story pressing on her chest. She thought of her own mother, her brother, the fragile thread of family holding her life together. To lose them like that, to see the world shrug at the loss, was unimaginable. It didn't excuse the cruelty, but it explained it. For the first time, she didn't just see Henry Blackthorne as a monster. She saw a man lashing out from a wound that would never heal. The staff room door creaked open. A busboy poked his head inside, whispering nervously, he's asking for his wine to be topped up. Every eye turned to Clara. Peterson sighed, defeated. Go on, Dawson. You've poked the dragon. Now you're the only one he'll allow near the fire. Clara rose slowly, smoothing her apron. She had walked into the restaurant seeking nothing more than a paycheck. Now she felt as though she had stepped onto a battlefield, one where her courage and composure were the only armor she had left. And Henry Blackthorne, the wounded tyrant of Table 9, was waiting. From that night onward, Table 9 belonged to Clara Dawson. Week after week, Henry Blackthorne arrived at the Golden Lantern at precisely 7:30. His Lincoln pulled up to the curb, the valet opened the door, and the storm walked inside. The other servers sighed with relief when they saw Clara tighten her apron and step forward. The unspoken rule had changed, and the monster would have his chosen waitress, and the rest of the staff would be spared. Each Tuesday brought a new gauntlet. One week it was scallops seared for exactly 60 seconds per side, no more, no less. He ordered, his voice like steel. Clara relayed the command to the kitchen, and Antoine, the chef, nearly tore his hair out. Yet when the plate arrived, Clara carried it like a surgeon, balancing life in her hands. Blackthorne nudged one scallop with his fork, inspected its underside, tasted a bite. and said nothing. The silence was heavier than any insult. The next week, his glass of water. "Refill it when it's half empty," he told her, his pale eyes fixed on hers. Not before. Not after. Half. Clara memorized the shifting tide of liquid, watching the glass as though it held the fate of her family. The moment the water slipped below that invisible line, she was there, bottle in hand, precise as a metronome. Another week, the duck. "Replace the cherry sauce," he demanded. "Too pedestrian. I want orange and star anise, tart, not sweet. If sugar touches my tongue, I'll send it back." Antoine exploded in the kitchen. "What is this, a county fair? Does he think I invent sauces like party tricks?" But still the sauce was made, the duck plated, and Clara delivered it with unflinching calm. The staff watched from the corners of the room, whispering like parishioners at a strange, dangerous mass. Clara had become the lightning rod, absorbing the bolts of his wrath so no one else would burn. They called her mad or brave, or both. But when the night ended and the check was signed, there was always the same shock, an extravagant tip, so large it bordered on the absurd. Some weeks it was $500, others $2,000. Always more than any rational person would give, as if he were paying for her endurance, or perhaps testing whether she would break under the weight of cruelty bought with kindness. Clara never flinched. Her hands sometimes trembled in the locker room afterward, her breath catching as though she'd just survived a storm at sea. But on the floor, she was the picture of composure. She remembered her mother's hospital bills lined up on the kitchen counter like a stack of unpaid debts to fate. She remembered her younger brother's hopeful face, the tuition notice that threatened to slam the door on his future. Every order, no matter how absurd, was another step toward survival. Slowly, the staff began to look at her differently. No longer the new girl, no longer a lamb to the slaughter. She was the one who had stared down Blackthorn and lived. Some whispered dragon tamer, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. And Blackthorn himself, his face never softened his words, never gentled. But something unspoken began to shift. He no longer called her Waitress. He called her Dawson. His pale eyes studied her with a curious intensity, as though he were dissecting not just her service, but her soul. Every Tuesday night, the ritual repeated demands sharpened like knives, Clara meeting them with steady grace and the inevitable signature with its extravagant reward. It was no longer just a meal. It was a strange private war, a war of control, of patience, of survival, and Clara was winning. The rain that night fell in sheets, silver streaks, painting the windows of the Golden Lantern. Inside the dining room glowed warm and golden chandeliers sparkling against the storm. The regulars whispered over oysters and bourbon, their voices muffled by the steady percussion of water against glass. Clara moved between tables with practiced grace, but her heart was heavy. Her mother had been hopeful lately, too hopeful. The doctors had hinted at a new treatment, something promising. Clara wanted to believe it was possible. She wanted to believe there was a path forward, even if she couldn't yet see it. Her apron vibrated softly. She slipped into a narrow corridor near the staff entrance, a quiet alcove where the hum of conversation faded. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she pressed it to her ear. Her younger brother's voice was tight, trembling. "Clara, I just got off the call with the specialist. They sent the estimate." She gripped the phone. "How much?" A pause, then a whisper, $40,000. "And that's only for the first round. Insurance says it's experimental. They won't cover a dime." The number struck like a hammer to her chest. 40,000. She tried to steady her breathing, but the corridor spun. She imagined her mother's tired eyes, her brother's determined face, and the fragile little house where unpaid bills stacked higher each month. Clara pressed her back against the wall, whispering fiercely, "We'll figure it out, I promise. I can pick up more shifts. Maybe alone, just don't tell Mom. Let her keep that hope a little longer, please." Her brother's silence was heavy with worry. Finally, he murmured, "All right." They exchanged goodbyes, voices cracking, and Clara lowered the phone with shaking hands. She wiped at her eyes, took a breath, and turned, and froze. Henry Blackthorne stood less than 20 feet away, near the shadowed entrance to the restrooms. His broad frame seemed carved in stone, his posture unnervingly rigid. The cold glow of the hallway lights caught in his eyes, and Clara knew with the certainty of a condemned prisoner that he had heard everything. Her throat tightened. For an instant, she wanted to plead, to say something, anything. But Blackthorne gave no sign. He didn't sneer. He didn't mock. He didn't scold her for breaking the sacred rule against personal business on company time. He simply turned away. The rest of the evening passed in suffocating quiet. Blackthorne ate his meal with the same meticulous ritual as always. Each bite measured, each instruction obeyed. But he spoke almost nothing. His silence was heavier than any insult, and Clara felt it pressing against her chest with every step she took to and from his table. When he finally signed the check, he left no note, no cryptic phrase beneath his signature. Only the tip, still extravagant, still enough to make her dizzy, and then he was gone. Swallowed by the storm outside, Clara finished her shift in a fog. She expected the phone call the next morning, Mr. Peterson's voice, cold and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Clara. Mr. Blackthorne has requested you not return." Each ring of her phone made her stomach seize. But that call never came. 2 days later, instead, the phone rang with a different voice. Crisp, professional. "Good afternoon. May I speak with Clara Dawson?" "This is she. My name is Catherine Pierce. I'm a senior partner with the law firm of Pierce, Grant & Howell. I'm calling on behalf of a benefactor who wishes to remain anonymous. This benefactor has made us aware of your mother's medical case, the insurance denial, for her recommended treatment. They've asked us to take your case free of charge." Clara blinked, stunned, gripping the phone tighter. I never contacted any firm." "That's correct," Catherine replied gently. "Your benefactor arranged everything. We've already reviewed your file. I believe you have a strong chance at appeal. We'd like to meet tomorrow morning to discuss next steps." Clara sat down hard, her knees buckling beneath her. An anonymous benefactor. Who else could it be? Who else had stood in that corridor listening as her heart cracked open? She whispered, "Yes, tomorrow. I'll be there." When the call ended, Clara lowered the phone and pressed it against her chest. Gratitude and fear warred inside her. Relief that her mother might finally have a chance. Terror of the price such kindness might demand. Because kindness from Henry Blackthorne was never free. Sleep deserted Clara Dawson. Even after the law firm's call, after hearing Catherine Pierce's steady confidence that her mother's case could be won, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small apartment. Relief flickered in her chest, but it was tangled with suspicion. Anonymous benefactors didn't appear out of thin air. Not in her world, not in anyone's world. There was only one man who could have heard her desperation that night in the corridor. And if it was Henry Blackthorne, then nothing about him fit neatly into the box she had built in her mind. Monster. Tyrant. Control-obsessed sadist. How could that same man quietly hand her family a lifeline worth more than $40,000? By the next morning, Clara was hunched over her brother's old laptop at the kitchen table, coffee gone cold beside her. She typed name after name, phrase after phrase, insurance appeals, anonymous donor-victim advocacy. At first, nothing but stale press releases and headlines she already knew. But Clara had been raised to dig, to fight through clutter for answers. She pressed deeper past the first 10 pages of search results, past the paid ads and recycled blogs. And then she found it, a forgotten legal blog dated more than a decade ago. It spoke bitterly about the failure of a proposed bill, the Emily Margaret Bill. The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Emily and Margaret, Blackthorne's daughter and wife. The bill had aimed to impose harsher sentences for drunk drivers. Funding for the lobbying effort, the blog noted, had come from an anonymous donor. Her pulse quickened. Using that thread, she tugged harder. She found scattered references in tax filings for nonprofits, tiny footnotes in annual reports, a scholarship fund for aspiring public defenders, a grant for legal clinics that fought insurance giants on behalf of struggling families. Each time the benefactor was unnamed. But the pattern was there. The sums were enormous. The cause always the same: justice for the powerless. A crusade against the very injustices that had shattered Henry Blackthorne's life. Clara leaned back in her chair, stunned. The truth was staggering in its contradictions. The man who tormented waiters with impossible demands, who turned Tuesday nights into a ritual of cruelty, was also the man secretly waging a one-man war for fairness in a system that had failed him. His cruelty was a mask, his philanthropy an obsession, both born from the same abyss of grief. By the time Tuesday rolled around again, Clara felt like she was walking into the restaurant carrying a secret too heavy for her apron pocket. Her colleagues whispered as usual, but she heard none of it. She was consumed with one question: what would she say? When Henry Blackthorne arrived, he took his usual seat at table 9. The storm of demands seemed ready on his tongue, but Clara didn't wait. She set down his water, folded her hands, and in a voice low enough for only him to hear, she said, "I was reading about advocacy groups the other day. The kind that fight for families in silence. People who do good without ever asking for recognition. It struck me how rare that is, how powerful it can be." The dining room hummed around them, clinking glasses, low laughter, but between them stretched a silence thick with unspoken meaning. Henry's hands, resting on the white tablecloth, went perfectly still. His pale eyes locked on hers. For the first time, he wasn't appraising her, wasn't testing her. He was simply listening. His throat worked as if the words he carried had been buried for years. Finally, his reply came rough and almost tender. "Tonight," he said slowly, "I'll have the scallops exactly as the chef prepares them. No specifications, no tests, no impossible demands." It was a white flag. Clara gave the smallest of nods, her lips curving with a smile that was more knowing than triumphant. The war of control was over, and in that fragile truce, Henry Blackthorne let slip the first crack of humanity he had shown in years. The call from Catherine Pierce's office came on a crisp autumn morning. Clara answered with trembling hands, bracing herself for disappointment. Instead, the lawyer's voice was bright with triumph. "We did it, Clara. The insurance company has reversed its decision. Your mother's treatment will be covered in full." Clara sank into a chair, tears blurring her vision. For the first time in months, the crushing weight pressing down on her family eased. Hope, fragile, shimmering, but real, returned. She clutched the phone, whispering a thank you over and over, until her voice broke. That evening, when Henry Blackthorne came to the Golden Lantern, Clara served him as always. But something was different. The storm that clung to him every Tuesday had quieted. His eyes, once sharp with suspicion, seemed softer, though the lines of grief etched deep into his face would never fully fade. He finished his meal in silence. Dessert came and went. And then, instead of standing and leaving, Henry lingered at the table. He folded his napkin carefully, set it aside, and looked up at Clara with a weight she had never seen before. Not the weight of disdain, but of decision. "You never bowed," he said finally. His voice was rough but not unkind. "You never feared me, and you saw past the monster." Clara held his gaze, saying nothing. "I've spent years hiding behind cruelty." Henry continued his words, slow, deliberate, letting people believe the worst because it kept the world at arm's length. But there's more work to be done. Quiet work. Work that matters. I'm starting a foundation, one that will carry on what I began in secret. The grants, the scholarships, the battles no one sees. And I want you to lead it. The words stunned her. A waitress barely scraping by offered the helm of a foundation that could change lives. It made no sense. And yet deep down, Clara understood. He wasn't choosing her for her resume or credentials. He was choosing her for her integrity, for the fire that kept her standing when others bent. Her throat tightened. "Mr. Blackthorne," I don't know what to say. "Say yes," he replied. For the first time in years, a smile, small, tentative, but real, touched his weathered face. That night, Clara Dawson said yes. The story did not end like a fairy tale. It ended with two wounded souls scarred in different ways, finding a purpose larger than themselves. Henry Blackthorne, the feared tyrant of Table 9, stepped out of the shadows he had built around himself. Clara Dawson, the young woman who had once carried menus and glasses to survive, stepped into a calling she never imagined. Together, they proved something timeless. That the people we fear most may carry the deepest scars. That the ones who test us most fiercely may be the ones who in silence fight hardest for others. And that empathy, the courage to truly see another human being, can turn grief into grace. The narrator lingers, voice low and thoughtful. Perhaps you've known someone like Henry Blackthorne, hard, bitter, impossible to please. Someone whose anger built a fortress around them. But behind every fortress is a story. Behind every scowl, a wound. Clara's courage reminds us that empathy is not weakness. It is strength. The kind of strength that can heal both the giver and the receiver. A pause just long enough for the weight of the words to settle. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes people can change. And if you'd like to hear more stories that reveal the hidden battles behind closed doors, subscribe to our channel and join the conversation below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The screen fades to black. The storm has passed, and in its wake, hope remains.